Hi, and welcome back to Debut Writers. In this episode, Deborah Froese, executive editor at Indigo River Publishing, is going to discuss how the editorial process works. From understanding the editor's role, learning how to navigate editorial feedback constructively, and discovering what makes a successful editor author partnership. Deb is an award winning fiction author and has been involved in editing and writing for over 20 years. She also hosts her own podcast, Write, Writer, Write. We actually met while working for Indigo River Publishing, and Deb was my initial mentor when I was learning the editorial process to start editing things myself. So, Deb, I'm thrilled to have you on again. If our listeners remember, Deb was also a guest on our first series, so make sure you go back and check out that episode. So, Deb, as an editor for a publishing company, how do you define the editor's role?
Well, before we get into that, I just want to say thanks, Anne, for having me on again. And it's wonderful to see you and reconnect.
I
So,
know. It's
how would
been
I
so long.
define the editor's role? The editor is there to guide the author through revisions and serves as a bridge between the reader and the author's vision. Because 9 times out of 10, what you think you're putting on the page as a writer is not what your readers are picking up. They'll pick up parts of it, but they don't pick up all of it. So the editor will take a look and see where things are falling short and help you pull it all together.
Yes, and we talked in a couple of the past episodes the different levels of editing and types of editing. And I think that developmental editing is so important because it will do that. It will pick up kind of where you've dropped the ball on something. I've talked openly about my dirty little secret on here, The Blood Inside Me, the self-published book. I was the only eyes on. I was the only editor on. I think my aunt read it the week before it was published, and all of her only feedback was it was good. And one of
Lovely to hear, but
I know, right? But it was all the mistakes I made before I ever knew like what was the publishing world or behind the curtains and all that stuff. And so the whole reason we developed this podcast to kind of like be that sounding board for new authors so they don't make the same mistakes we do. But I remember somebody was reading the book and they reached out to me and they were like, "I can't wait to learn what the glowing eyes in the forest mean." And I was like, "You're never going to find out because I forgot." But that
too
is the
late.
stuff that editors will like pick out and be like, or I loved also the idea of these characters are people in our head, and this story is something we know so deeply. But somebody else, when I talk about a character doing something, they're like, I have no idea why that character was motivated to say that or do that. And I'm like, well, I do. It's in my head. So an editor is so helpful during that very first edit, kind of pointing out all those things that as you read them as the author, you would never notice because you have all this information in your head and you don't realize other people don't have that.
That's right, because you just can't see what you haven't already put on the page, if that makes sense. But I just wanted to skip back a bit to the developmental editing. I actually think this is the most critical part of editing. Not only because it sets up your story, but because it's the part that writers most often overlook. When a writer thinks about editing, they think about getting in there and moving their words around. But moving your words around and choosing all the best words in the world and writing prosaically does nothing if the story doesn't make sense. So, with the developmental edit, if you're working with a developmental editor, what they'll do is they'll review your story and they'll stand back and look at it and just twig to the different things that aren't ringing true, that don't make sense, where the pieces don't come together. You were talking about character motivation. When a character says or does something on a consistent basis, it's because of something inside them. And your editor will help you set that up to make sure it's coming across the reasons why, so that readers come to know the character as well as you do. But you can do that on your own too. Like if I know this is you're talking about what you can expect in a developmental process, but an author can also do that developmental edit, at least an initial one on their own, if they take a step back from their work. And you ideally step away for 6 weeks or so because you'll forget some of what you've done. But you can also look at it in a different format than what you've seen it before and just take notes. Don't let yourself edit or make changes. Just take notes, talk into your phone. I love to do that because if I'm talking into my phone and reading on my Kindle, like I often upload manuscripts to my Kindle, I can't make notes. I can just talk and it doesn't somehow break that thread. But that's the important thing. You have to look at the story as a whole, not just a chapter or a paragraph or even a sentence. You've got to look at the whole and how it comes together.
I saw a meme one time and I loved it because it said your first draft is just putting all the sand in the sandbox.
Yes.
And all then you have to like actually build the castle because I definitely follow the Stephen King's like just vomit all the words onto the page and just keep writing every day and get it down. You can't edit something that you never finished. And so, but yeah, I'm definitely like I just have a bunch of sand and I as I read through my first versions, I'm always like, "Oh wow." Like
Well, the other thing is
so
that
many
when
notes.
you have an idea when you start writing about what you want your story to be about, but as you write, you discover more about your characters, about your story world, about what's happening, and you come up with all kinds of other ideas to include. Now, if you stop to put all of those things in while you're writing, you'll never get anywhere. But if you keep a few notes on the side, then by the time you get to the end, you've got all this wealth of information that you have to go back and weave in. So I would suggest that if you're getting a publisher to look at your work, or even a friend, don't give them the first draft. Give them the second or third. Like never, like the first draft, nobody should see it but you because first drafts are usually horrible. You'll be really excited because you poured lots of work into it, lots of energy, and you want people's approval. You want them to like it, right? So the
Yes.
temptation is to get somebody else to read it, but don't do it. Not until you've gone through it a few times and gone over it developmentally.
Yes, we've talked about this too, about like how many times you have to read your book before you even pass it to somebody else to read it. How I see so many people typing the end and being so excited. And it is, it's an amazing accomplishment to finally
It
finish
is.
that first draft in that book. I know people labor over that for years sometimes. But that is like just as if your goal was to just write a book and get something down on paper, like you've accomplished that goal. But if your goal is to get published, that is step one of like almost 100 steps. Like there's so many other
There's so
things
many.
you have to go through. And it's, I definitely did not know that as a first time writer, all the things I had to do. And I can't tell you how many rejections I got on my very first draft that I queried out to like all these agents because I didn't even know any better.
How would you?
I know, I know. You know, when you Google how do you publish a book, there's only so much information out there. So
Well, that's where your podcast comes in handy.
yes, yes. And so when you are kind of talking about that story development and you're putting those notes down, we had another episode about outlining, like do you or don't you outline? Do you see a difference in an author who's outlined their story versus an author who hasn't outlined their story?
I would say yes, or I'm usually only guessing, but an outline helps the story stay on track. And it doesn't have to be like a play-by-play outline. Even just a general sense of direction. If you have a few plot points, know what the beginning, middle, and end are like, and then you can gradually fill it in. But if you don't have a map, you could end up lost, just like a ship at sea. No compass, who knows where you're going to end up? It's water all the way around. And if you don't have a map, your story can go anywhere. And you want that freedom to go anywhere, but you also know that you have to have a few guardrails. Keep them distant, but have something to go by. Don't just dive in and start writing with no sense of direction, or you'll have nothing.
So that's literally how I wrote my first two books. I
Sorry.
just like had the kind of general idea and then I just dove in and wrote it. And like you said, like the characters kind of take on their own space and the story kind of moves in directions maybe you never even saw coming. But then that resulted in me having to do such massive revisions at the beginning because I wrote the beginning not really knowing the end, or I wrote the beginning with a different ending in mind. So I had to go back. And I am finding now, as I'm on, like, I just finished my fourth book, I am now realizing how important it is for me to brainstorm and outline and at least get a very solid understanding of how it's going to end. What is my big
Mhm.
twist? What is my big reveal at the end? Because I want to drop hints to that in the beginning. And so I have learned that that really does make it helpful for me to have, like you said, like the directions and guardrails and stuff.
Well, and it's true because the way your mind works, if you have an outline and you know where you're going, even if you're not consciously thinking about your direction, your subconscious mind will be leading you in that direction. But again,
Like that.
no outline, no goal.
I
And
know.
I don't mean that people have to be serious plotters. If they're not, that's fine. Write your first draft knowing basically what direction you're going. And then later, when you're doing revisions, you can take a look at plotting and structure and how it's all coming together. But by plotting loosely, you have a little bit more freedom. If you happen to be a pantser and you don't like the idea of a structure, just know where you're going and be prepared to look at structural elements later.
Yes. And so that leads us kind of to like the next level of editing, which would be the line editing. So you've
Mhm.
kind of got your story developed. And so tell us kind of how that line editing process goes.
Okay. Well, after the developmental editing is done, after the authors moved all their pieces around, added missing information, all that kind of stuff, then it's time to go through the manuscript line by line. And at this point, what you're really looking for is a natural flow to the narrative, and you're looking for realistic character voices. People don't speak in complete sentences, and if your manuscript is filled with perfect sentences, readers won't connect with that. You're also looking for ways to enhance the emotional intensity of the manuscript. So this is where the fine tuning of the actual writing comes into play. You've got your framework, you've draped your fabric over it nicely, and it's really, you can see the shape, but now you're just smoothing the fabric down and ironing out the wrinkles.
Yes, and it's such an important piece. And I think so many authors also feel like line edit somehow involves developmental edit too. When I was coaching one author about, hiring an editor, I was very clear with her about like, this is the type of editing you need. Like, you've got to go through that developmental phase and then you've got to go through that line edit phase. They're two totally different spaces for an editor. So making sure that you're not just I just, do you find that an editor can do both of those successfully, or do you find that it's better to do them separately?
I think it really depends on the project and the editor. If you're, for example, you're doing a fantasy novel with a complex story world and multiple layers, it's you need to develop a mental editor who's also a good line editor, somebody who can take both those pieces, because otherwise you're learning the story world, you're getting everything in shape, and then you're passing it on to another editor who has to learn that story world all over again.
Yeah.
So I find in those situations, if you've got a strong editor, but you need a really strong editor who's got lots of experience in both. I will say that even though we sort of divided into developmental and line editing stages, there is still some overlap. Like a good line editor is still going to pick up if there's something developmentally off. Well, you mentioned that ribbon on page 10, and it seemed to have real significance. So does it? Or should you just pull the ribbon out, or pull it back so it doesn't seem to have so much, so it doesn't set up readers' expectations for something phenomenal to happen around that ribbon. So they'll have their eyes open for those kinds of things, and they might notice some character details that could be enhanced. But it's more about refinement and enhancing than it is about actually chunking and moving things around and filling in holes or pulling out excess material, because you go down too many rabbit holes and you'll lose your readers, right? Well, there is a quote about something about um, just don't write the parts that readers skip, which is basically, a lot of readers will just skim over it if it's boring, so don't let it be boring. Don't write that stuff.
Yes. I'm like, if I, it's so funny because I typically listen to books these days because anytime I have to physically read a book, it's like submissions and it's my own stuff.
Hmm.
And so I typically like listen to books and there are parts where I'm like, this would probably be the part of the book where I would start like flipping pages. Like, I got it. I get it. I always hate to like kind of, and this isn't really bashing the author, but I remember my very first editor for my very first book, A Lost Woman. She read the book and she was like, "Look, you need to up your descriptive writing game. Like it's all tell, and like you really need to be more showing in a lot of places." And so she had me go read Where the Crawdads Sing. And just so you know, I didn't actually read it. I listened to it because again,
Okay.
like you never have time to read a book. But it was 14 hours. Oh my goodness. I remember I was going on a really long road trip. I forget where I was going up north somewhere. And so I listened to it and my mom listened to it with me. And there were times where I was like, I really wish I could fast forward this thing because it's like a labor of love, kind of the way she describes the swamp and she just goes on and on and on. And I know she was revered for that and people loved that writing. And I did take a lot from her book and I implemented a lot more descriptive writing in my own work And then it was like comp to her. And I was like, oh, well, that might be because I read her book and like, took a lot from that. But I found that there was like definitely a balance that you had to find
Yes.
between the show and the tell. And you had to figure out when do you kind of explain something versus when do you just like tell it and move on.
Yeah. And basically, the tell it and move on is when you want to just provide information that is important to the story. The rest of it can usually be shown by a character's reaction to the scene unfolding around them or the situation they're
Yes,
in.
and I find that is one of the biggest mistakes authors make. Like when I'm meeting with authors and they're like, I can't get an agent interested in my work, and I start reading their work, it is because you're telling a lot of stuff that you could be showing. And this is how you could be showing it. And so, and also, too, I think people are really shying away, and correct me if I'm wrong, from character descriptions. Like they're really kind of coming back and saying, we want you to understand this character on an emotional level. It doesn't matter if she's got brown hair or blonde hair. Like, there, so it's kind of like that pullback from like making sure you understand every feature about this character. It's more so I want you to understand every emotion and motive of this character.
I think the ideal character description, if you will, is somewhere in the middle. You know how when you know someone, they just give you a sense about them, about who they
Mhm.
are. And it's not necessarily that you're visualizing them, but you feel the presence of that person. And I think that's what you need to evoke with a fictional character to really draw your readers in. That does involve some description, but it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to describe every detail. You give like the general shape of the silhouette, if you will, or a key characteristic about them, something that triggers an image. I just read a quote the other day, and I wish I could remember it because it was fantastic. It was about the idea that the writer, a really good writer, will plant one little seed, and from that seed, a flower will grow. So they give you that idea, just a glimmer of an idea, and from that, your imagination produces the rest. And that's what really good writing does, because when it does that, it's drawing you into the story. It's appealing to you on an emotional level, and it's connecting you with that character and helping you feel who they are in that world.
Yes, I totally agree. I was just thinking about like instead of saying the woman wore like a red sequin dress, like you could say she picked at the sequins on her dress and they looked like
Yes.
red blood droplets on her fingers. Because then you're asking, okay, well, why would blood be like the first thing she's going to? And like, what is this situation, you know?
Yeah. And I think that relates to just an overall um, key to providing solid backstory, which basically character description is. Incorporate it into the present story action. How can you make it a part of what is? Not just that somebody sees it in a given scene, but that it means something within that given scene. So
Yeah.
picking at the sequins on her dress is perfect.
Yeah. And so the last, well, not the last phase of editing, because there's always proofreading at the end, guys, that needs to
Hmm.
be done. Do not leave out the proofreading. That is where you get embarrassed because you forgot a comma or you forgot a period or the word was grossly misspelled or capital letters like we were talking about. So never skip the proofreading. But the copy edit, like what does that entail and that's different from like a proofreading?
Okay. The copy edit is a deeper version of proofreading, and I would say it's kind of a bridge between line editing and proofreading. But the copy edit focuses on consistency. It focuses on ensuring the manuscript meets the publisher's style guidelines. Like there are different style guides. The one readers or listeners will probably be most familiar with is the idea of the Oxford comma. Some style guides don't use the Oxford comma. The Chicago Manual of Style, which I use and which most publishers use, does use the Oxford comma.
Well, I'm
So there's
notorious for
very
having my own
specific.
comma rules.
Pardon me?
I'm notorious for having my own comma rules, and
Well, I think most of us are. I still do that too. When I get really harried, if I'm really busy, I'm still looking up the comma rules because my brain will get fried.
but I
So
like make
it's
up my
just,
own because I'm like, I want the comma here.
well,
I like it
and there
here.
you go. But it'll also, we were just talking earlier too about in copy editing, you'll be looking for consistency. So that means that sometimes words are used in different ways. For example, you might say Captain Jones, but you might also refer to the captain. In
Mm-hmm.
both instances, they are not capitalized. It's capitalized when you refer to Captain Jones. It's lowercase when you say the captain. And these are kinds of things that copy editors will pick up on to make sure everything is consistent and proper usage. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. Proofreaders will look for that, but they're also kind of looking at the overall appearance of the manuscript. Like sometimes in layout, things will go off. Like you might have a page break in a weird place or a hyphen in a weird place. So they catch those kinds of things too. But there is, as a designer friend of mine once told me many years ago when I was lamenting over an error in a printed book, there is no such thing as a perfect book,
Mm-hmm.
only a perfect read. And I took that to heart because what you want as an author is for people to be so immersed in your work that they won't see those details. And if they do, they'll just brush on by them because they're so focused on the story.
And I think we underestimate our minds too and how we fill in the
Yes.
blanks. And that is why, again, I say like it's really hard for you to read your own work, edit it.
Hmm.
And it's, but even that proofreading phase, it's really hard for you because you will skim over stuff and your brain will put it there because it knows it's
Hmm.
supposed to be there.
That
Whereas
is
if
so
it's
true.
like somebody's cold read, they don't have that expectation. So they're much more likely to see it. And, yeah, I've done a couple of proofreadings here and there, and same with the formatting. Like a friend of mine just is through that formatting phase, and she was like, as I'm reading the formatted version, I'm seeing all these like problems, and I really wish I would have like seen that before because like again she said the spacing is off, the page, I wish I knew page breaks were going to be where they were going to be and all that stuff. And I was like, it's one of those things where she's a first time author and she's very type A about every tiny little thing, so I'm like, it's okay, you can let that go.
And it
Again,
is
it's
because I
a
think
story.
anything that you're focused on that you've been working on, there will be things you don't see that other people see, and there will be things that other people see that just you miss. And that is why it's always good to have other eyes on your work. They say writing is a lonely profession, but it shouldn't stay that way. If you are writing to share your work with other people, you need feedback from other people to know whether the words that you're putting on the page really portray the image you want to convey. And that's where editors are a bridge between the author and their audience.
Yes. So shifting gears a little bit, what should that relationship look like? Like what should it feel like working with an editor?
If you're working with a good editor, it should feel like a comfortable relationship. You're probably, if you've never worked with an editor before, you're probably going to be extremely nervous going in.
Hmm.
They should be able to hold your hand and tell you what to expect. And you should be prepared that when you first open a document with track changes, you will probably gag. You'll think, I'm a horrible writer. I don't know why they signed me. I'm never going to write another book. But understand that it's all part of the process. Nobody, and I mean nobody, writes a perfect first draft or second draft or third draft. Very rarely is it done in that kind of
Agreed.
speed. So, and look at everything that changes, not as an error. This is not an error. Writing is a process of discovery, and by engaging editors, you're discovering more about what it is you're trying to do. And so, you're working with that editor should be a little bit nerve wracking at first because you're not used to it, but there should be a free give and take. There has to be some compromise. Sometimes your editor is going to make changes that you don't like. Well, question them about why and explain what you're trying to do because it could be they gave you bad information because they didn't get the information they needed from your pages. So it's an ongoing conversation, or it certainly should be while you're going through the entire process.
I had an editor point out one time that in one of my back scenes for A Lost Woman, the girl's hair color was wrong. And I was like, no, it wasn't. You haven't gotten to the end yet, clearly. Like, keep reading. It was like a little one of those little like drop hints of like just to show like if you're really paying attention. And then once you know what the truth is behind that at the end of the book, you go back and you're like, ah, I can see the hints that she was like dropping in there. But that editor just thought I was like doing it wrong. But for pointing that out, the same editor that went through A Lost Woman did not notice my name change halfway through the book. The only person who has ever pointed out that name change to me. So going back to like nothing's ever perfect and like we labor over these things, my mother-in-law is the only one who ever noticed that name change. And she goes, the only reason I noticed the name change is because it changed from my mother's name to my granddaughter's name. Because and yeah, and I was like, just so everybody knows, if there is a name in my book, that is somebody I know. Like I never match the name with the actual character, but I steal names from my friends.
Well, there's something about doing that um, or certainly drawing upon people you know to create your characters. There are people in my life pepper the pages of my books, but I try not to make direct association because I don't want to, step on anybody's toes. But we are, as writers, we're informed by what we experience, and we certainly experience the people in our lives.
Yes, and I feel like every book I've written has an officer of some sort in it, like where it's the detective or where it's the PI or whether it's the sheriff. But they end up always having the last name Morris, which is like I've got these best friends, they're twins, and it's their last name. And they're always like, why are we like, why was I like the fat, lazy cop and then like the alcoholic detective? Like, I just feel like I guess I think Morris is like a really good like cop name.
It does have a good kind of cop ring to it.
I know, right?
Well,
But
that could be your thing, right? Like a lot of writers have things. Like Stephen King has a town where all his stories take place. There a lot of writers do that.
yeah, everything I write is taking place in Lake Martin in some form or another because that's where I go and like write and get my inspiration every
Well,
summer.
that's
So
cool.
I know it's like really fun to kind of have that like theme that you can carry out throughout all your books, right? So, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions or misunderstandings that a debut writer specifically could have in working with an editor that let's start with first an editor that they've hired and then an editor that they're working with going through a publishing company?
Okay. Here's the basic difference. An editor that you hire is working for you. They may still be trying to bridge the gap between you and your writer, but you are going to be steering the ship unless you make it very clear up front. I want your expertise. So if something's wrong, let me know. If you're hiring an editor, you have to be very clear about what you want from it, or they're going to give you what you want to hear. Even if that's not what they're trying to do, that's going to be the natural tendency because you're footing the bill.
Yeah.
If you go to a publisher, they're looking at the bigger picture. They want you to be happy, or at least most of them do. There's probably some out there they don't care; they just want the book. But but the idea is they want you to be happy, but they also want readers to be happy. They want readers to look at that book. So the editor is going to be a little bit more inclined to bridge that gap. So if you're writing something that maybe isn't coming across clearly and you think it is, or you've chosen a track that is not going to resonate with readers, they're going to push harder on you, but it's for the purpose of selling books. And sometimes, there can be compromises made there, but there's a slightly different angle from the approach. They're either working for you or they're working for a bunch of people, the publisher, the audience, and the author.
See, and I had such a hard time when I was doing editing, and I realized I was like, I just don't think that's my favorite space. I really thought it was going to be my favorite. I really thought I was going to love editing, and I was so excited to dive into it when I started with you. But then I did find that every time I dove into a book, it was really hard for me to not want to change big things in the story or like add my what I would think is the best thing for that story. And so it was really hard for me to dial myself back from the book.
That is a learning curve because you can, as a writer, and I'm a writer before I'm an editor. When I look at something, I see all the story idea. My creative imagination gets going, and all these ideas bubble up. So over the years, I've kind of learned to step back and say, okay, well, what is the author trying to achieve? Is what I'm seeing going to help them get there? Is it going to help them meet their vision? If it is, if I think it will help them meet their vision, then I'll share it. But if it's not, then I just bite my tongue. And you have to also, as an editor, accept the fact that not every writer is going to dive in and do all the work that you would do.
And that was the painful thing too, the
Yes,
hours that I would put into editing the book. And then I see the next version or the version that's printed and comes out, and I'm like,
I know.
they send me the next version. I like somewhere along the process I get like a different version of it and I'm like, you didn't implement the original changes I gave you.
Well,
Like,
part of this, and this is maybe a good thing for authors to understand too. As the author, you are the creator of the book, but it is not a solitary journey once you are trying to get on the road to publication. And
that's
I
good. Yeah.
can guarantee you, your editor is putting in as much blood, sweat, and tears as you are. Like I know for certain, put more time in editing some books than the author put into writing it. No, I'm
I
serious. I
definitely
mean,
had one author like that.
yeah. And I mean, it was good because the book ends up being a better product and the author's happy with it in the end. But I just don't, I want authors to understand that editing is not just to simply brush things off and pass it down the line. It's a deeply complicated effort that's designed to bring you and your readers together.
Yes, I love how you say that bridging the gap. That's really excellent. So, with that tone, how do you, because you're always kind of already kind of talking about it, but how do you support authors beyond that kind of editorial feedback? Like, what else do you, with your own business and what you do outside of working with the publishing company, how do you also support authors?
I think my biggest thing focus right now is with the podcast. It's based on three pillars: skill, mindset, and impact. And a large part of it focuses around mindset because I think every writer I know has had some mindset issues. They either think they can't write or it could be better, or, they'll never get it right. And they look at things that aren't turning out the way they want it to be as mistakes rather than attempts, investigations, following their curiosity. So I work a lot with mindset, and through that podcast, I'm also developing a series of programs on how to plan a novel without having to resort to intricate plotting. I've got an
Ooh.
approach that is based more on the idea of form, of understanding story form, of feeling your way through a story and relying on your intuition and determining the difference between your intuition, which is a soft and quiet voice, or your inner critic, which is the one we usually hear, which says, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to read it anyway. Why do you bother? And that's the voice that shuts you down. It's a psychological thing. It's trying to protect you from judgment or your fear of whatever might happen. But I focus a lot in those areas. But I love writing in the sense that I think everybody should write, even if it's not for publication, because through the process of writing and trying to express your ideas clearly, you get to know yourself better. And when you get to know yourself better, you have a better experience of the world, a better understanding of other people. And if you are writing because you want other people to read it, you'll have more skills to bring your work to life. You'll have a better understanding of the human community. And I think these skills are particularly important in this day and age when AI is so prevalent. I know a
Yes.
lot of people are frantic about AI, and there are reasons to be frantic, but it can also do a lot of things that humans can't. And I find it is a great brainstorming partner. If you have an idea you want to bounce around or want to find some threads for, it's great for that. I would never let it write on my behalf because it doesn't, it repeats itself. It uses
Yes.
the same tone. Everything written by AI you can recognize. I might let it draft like a short article or a social media post or something, but I've never had it come up with something that I could just use verbatim. So it can save you a lot of time. It can work as a brainstorming partner. And but we have to understand that with all of that, you still have to be fully human
Yes.
to really make the most impactful writing.
I also think there's AI programs. We were just talking about this before we started recording, always, right? But
Yeah.
we were talking about some programs that you've used before that are really great first steps in editing. Like maybe you don't have before you go and spend that money on a developmental editor or a line editor, running it through some of these programs just to catch the bare basic stuff that you're missing, the really glaringly obvious stuff that if you go pay a developmental editor thousands of dollars and they come back with, well, look, you had all these like really big picture issues. And it was hard for me to like get down to the nitty gritty of like, what really needed to be moved and around and like what was really missed because you had these bigger issues that honestly an AI program could have like told you out the gate about that or a beta reader, somebody like that.
Well, I wouldn't even go to a beta reader with an early draft because you want to save them for when you've done your best work and you know it's as good as you can do it on your own. There is one program, it's called, it just flew out of my head. AutoCrit. AutoCrit will give a really deep developmental analysis of your manuscript, but if you're a new writer, you might find it overwhelming. It gives so much feedback that your head will be spinning. And like most AI, it is repetitive. It says the same thing over and over again in 10 different ways. And so you've got to filter through all that mush to get down to the meat of the matter. The upside is it goes far deeper in like about 20 minutes than a human being could go over a week. So
Yeah.
there are advantages to that program. It's also, I think there's a 30-day trial if you want to check it out and see if you can work with it. But if you do, Go into it being prepared that it is going to be overwhelming. The information you get will be overwhelming.
Yes, I felt like that. I did Marlowe. I was like really excited to try that program. I It was by an author that I really love. She created it. And Marlowe was supposed to basically like go through your book and tell you what pieces you were missing in order
Mhm.
to make it a bestseller because there's breaking the bestseller code. It's that author that kind of put the program together. But I gotta say, it was very like surface level on a lot of stuff. And when it would point stuff out, like to say, hey, this isn't right or this doesn't sound right. I'm like, you're taking that out of context though. Like you clearly like the AI program is just looking for certain words and not
Yes.
reading it in context. So yeah, AI is always with a grain of salt.
Yeah. And it does tend to take things out of context, and it does not recognize subtleties at all.
Yes.
So there's pros and cons. I think we'll probably get to the place where it can do a really convenient and concise developmental analysis. I mean, these are still the early days of AI, but it is a tool that you can use and find some benefit from if you're prepared to weed through it to get to the meat of the matter.
Yes. So, Deb, this has been so awesome talking to you again. Can you tell our listeners how they can find you?
Well, you can find me on my website. It's www.deborahfroese.com, and that's DEBORAHFROESE. So that was a mouthful anyway.
We will link it in the comments and
Okay,
on our
great.
Substack newsletter, so we can
Yeah, you
definitely
can find me there, and also take a listen to my podcast if you're interested. The episodes are really short. They range somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes each. They focus on a general idea. There is a novel planning series at the beginning of the earlier episodes of the podcast, and it'll give you it goes deep in a way, but it shows you how to rely on your instincts and your sensitivities rather than on building a hard structure.
Yes, I highly recommend it. It's a great series.
Thank you.
Especially if you're like a debut writer, it can really like help you solidify that writing process. Well, that's awesome, Deb. Thank you so much. And next week, we are going to be talking to a literary agent, and we're really going to be focusing on how polished does your manuscript need to be before you start pitching it to agents. We all know I have made this grave mistake so many times in my life. And so I'm so excited to get to talk to a literary agent and really hear from her the expectation of your manuscript before you ever even start down that publication process. And so tune in next week. Make sure you subscribe on our YouTube channel and to our Substack newsletter and follow us on Spotify and Apple. Thank you. And Deb, thanks again so much for
Oh,
coming.
and thanks so much for having me. It was great to see you, and I'm really intrigued about your next week's episode.
Ooh, yeah, tune in.